Models of generosity. All local communities of faith are to be models of generosity to other churches. Here's Gene to explain.
And I want to share with you 2 Corinthians 8, 1-7. I can't really break this passage up. We just need to look at the whole thing. He says, "We want you to know, brothers, sisters, about the grace of God granted to the churches of Macedonia." And remember that when he wrote this, he had received the letter or received the report from Titus. He was in Macedonia, suffered in Macedonia. But when he says the churches of Macedonia, he's probably referring to the Philippians, to the Bereans, and to the Thessalonians, because that was the Macedonian region. There may have been some other cities, but these are the primary cities that are mentioned in the New Testament. And he talks about the grace of God that came to these churches. He says, during a severe testing by affliction, their abundance of joy, there refers now to the believers in these churches, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed into the wealth of the generosity. And you don't use the word poverty unless there's poverty. I mean, they had needs themselves, needs that were not being met. And so he talks about this poverty, and he says God's grace came to them in the midst of their poverty. I testify that on their own, according to their ability, which wasn't much, beyond their ability, and when you say beyond their ability, they were generous beyond what anyone would expect. They begged us. Paul said no. They said please. They begged us insistently for the privilege of sharing in the ministry to the saints. And the saints there now are the saints in Jerusalem, the poor. And not just as we had hoped. Instead, and here's a fabulous truth. Instead, they gave themselves especially to the Lord, first of all, then to us by God's will. So we urge Titus that just as he had begun, so he should also complete this grace to you. He's going to send Titus back to them. Now, as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, knowledge, and all diligence, and in your love for us, excel also in this grace. Now, you see, the disappointment comes in that when he wrote the first letter, in chapter 16, he said this. Now about the collection for the saints, he's talking about the same thing here, this special project. You should do the same as I instructed the Galatian churches. He had been through the Galatian region, which would be Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch of Pisidia, Smyrna, those churches. On the first day of the week, and here's his instruction, each of you is to set something aside and save to the extent that he prospers, so there are no collections will need to be made when I come. And when I arrive, I'll send those whom you recommend by letter to carry your gracious gift to Jerusalem. If it is also suitable for me to go, they will travel with me. Now, what had happened was, Paul instructed them as to what they should do, but they had failed to do it. And so he's writing back to them, and he's using the Thessalonian churches as a model to encourage them to complete what they said they were going to do. The reflection and response question that I see here that's so applicable is this. Why is it that Christians who have little of this world's goods are often willing to be more generous than Christians who have abundance? The interesting thing here is that the Corinthians evidently were doing very well. The city was prosperous. The economy was good. They had plenty. It wasn't true in Macedonia. They were in economic poverty for some reason or other. We're not sure why. And here, the Macedonian churches and the people in those churches were more generous than the Corinthians themselves. And the question, I think, applies to our culture. Why is it that Christians who have so little of this world's goods are often willing to be more generous than Christians who have abundance? And by generous here, we're thinking in terms of as you are able. And as I was thinking about this, in fact, I shared it with several in the office today when we were reviewing these principles. I can think of a widow lady who supports our ministry every month with a generous check based on her resources. And every time that check comes in to the Center for Church Renewal, I wonder how in the world she's doing it. Because I know her situation. And I know she also supports a church. And she's giving out of very, very little. Now, I've known this lady for a long, long time, and I know how faithful she is. And when you compare her generosity with many of us, including yours truly, she is generous. And why is that? I think, in some respects, that the more we have, the more we keep for ourselves, for some reason or other, proportionally. And I think that's so true of American Christians. It's kind of reverse math. You know, we talk about, you know, if you have $100 and you give a tithe with 10, you know, that doesn't seem to be too tough. You know, if you have 1,000 and you give 100, that 100 seems like an awful lot. You have 100,000, you give 10,000. Boy, that 10,000, that's a big check. And yet it's the same percentage. You have 200,000, you give 20,000. That is getting to be a big check. And we tend to forget how big the 200,000 is. You know, it just seems to work that way. And I've seen it. I've seen it in people's lives. The fact is, it should be the opposite if we're going to be proportional. It should go up, percentage-wise. The more we have, the more we should give proportionately, not percentage-wise. And I think in the American culture, we have a sort of reverse math. And I think it's something we really, really need to look at in our Christian lives, and something we really need to come to grips with. We need to be models of generosity.